In June of 2002, a 14-year-old girl vanished from her bedroom in the middle of the night while her family slept just feet away. No forced entry, no scream, no sound. For 9 months, Elizabeth Smart became the subject of one of the largest manhunts in American history. The FBI investigated every lead. Thousands searched. Her face was everywhere, but no one could find her. Then, one day, her sister remembered the one thing investigators had been missing all along. Before we dive into this incredible story, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and subscribe to Seek Stories for more unbelievable true crime mysteries. To understand what happened to Elizabeth Smart, you need to know about the family she came from and the community that shaped her childhood. Because what makes this case so terrifying is that it happened to a family who did everything right, in a neighborhood where everyone felt safe. The Smart family lived in Federal Heights, an affluent neighborhood in the foothills overlooking Salt Lake City, Utah. It's the kind of place where children ride bikes freely, where neighbors know each other by name, where parents don't worry about letting their kids play outside until dark. The streets are wide and tree-lined. The homes are beautiful, well-maintained. It's the American dream, safe, prosperous, wholesome. Ed and Lois Smart were pillars of their community. Ed was a successful real estate developer and mortgage broker. Lois was a devoted mother and harp teacher who gave lessons from their home. They were deeply religious members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and their faith was central to everything they did. They raised their children with strong values, emphasizing education, music, service to others, and family unity. The Smarts had 6 children, and Elizabeth was the second oldest. Born on November 3, 1987, Elizabeth Ann Smart grew up in an environment of love, stability, and opportunity. She was a bright, talented girl. She played the harp beautifully, just like her mother. She was an excellent student who loved school. She was kind, thoughtful, and deeply compassionate toward others. By the time Elizabeth was 14 in 2002, she was blossoming into a remarkable young woman. She had long blonde hair, bright eyes, and a warm smile. She was active in her church youth group. She volunteered in the community. She babysat for neighbors. She was the kind of teenager every parent hopes their child will become: responsible, caring, grounded in good values. The Smart home itself was large and comfortable, befitting a successful family. It was a 2-story house with multiple bedrooms, beautifully decorated, filled with the sounds of harp music and children's laughter. Elizabeth shared a bedroom on the 2nd floor with her 9-year-old sister, Mary Catherine. The 2 girls were close, sharing secrets and giggles late into the night, the way sisters do. In the spring of 2002, the Smart family made a decision that would change their lives forever, though they had no way of knowing it at the time. They hired a homeless man to do some work around their property. This wasn't unusual for the Smarts. Their faith taught them to help those less fortunate, and they often gave work to people who needed it. The man called himself Emmanuel. He was in his late 40s with a scraggly beard and weathered appearance. He'd approached Ed Smart downtown, asking if there was any work available. Ed, always willing to help, brought Emmanuel home and paid him to do some roofing repairs and rake leaves for about 5 hours of work. Emmanuel was paid for his labor and sent on his way. The family thought nothing more of it. It was just another act of charity, another opportunity to live their values. Emmanuel had seemed strange, perhaps, but harmless. He'd done his work and left. The interaction seemed insignificant, but Emmanuel had noticed something during those 5 hours at the Smart home. He'd noticed Elizabeth. He'd seen where the family's bedrooms were located. He'd observed the layout of the house. And he'd begun planning something unspeakable. Emmanuel's real name was Brian David Mitchell. He was a drifter with a dark history and a disturbed mind. Mitchell had been excommunicated from the LDS Church years earlier. He'd developed increasingly bizarre religious delusions, declaring himself a prophet chosen by God. He'd written a rambling 27-page manifesto he called The Book of Emmanuel David Isaiah, filled with distorted religious teachings and justifications for polygamy. Mitchell was married to a woman named Wanda Barzee, who was equally troubled. Barzee had her own history of mental illness and had become completely devoted to Mitchell, believing in his self-proclaimed prophet status. Together, they lived a transient lifestyle, moving between campsites in the mountains above Salt Lake City, occasionally panhandling in the city below. But Mitchell wanted more than just a follower. His twisted theology told him he was entitled to multiple wives, and during those hours working at the Smart home, he'd chosen his next victim, 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart. On the evening of June 4, 2002, the Smart family went about their normal routines. It was a Tuesday, an ordinary weeknight. Elizabeth had been practicing her harp earlier in the day. The family had dinner together, talked about their days, enjoyed each other's company. As evening turned to night, the children prepared for bed. Elizabeth and Mary Catherine went upstairs to their shared bedroom. They changed into their pajamas. Elizabeth wore red silk pajamas that her grandmother had given her. The girls talked quietly for a while before settling down to sleep. It was warm that June night, so they left the window slightly open for fresh air. The neighborhood was quiet and peaceful. Everything felt safe. Downstairs, Ed and Lois did a final check of the house before going to bed themselves. They locked the doors, turned off lights, looked in on the younger children. Everything was secure. Everything was fine. The Smart family went to sleep that night believing they were safe in their home, in their good neighborhood, in their careful life. They had no idea that someone was watching their house, that someone was waiting for all the lights to go out, that someone was preparing to shatter their world forever. Brian David Mitchell had been observing the Smart home for weeks since he'd worked there. He'd noted the family's patterns, the layout of the property, the location of Elizabeth's bedroom window, and on that warm June night, he made his move. In the early morning hours of June 5, 2002, sometime around 1 or 2 a.m., Mitchell cut through a window screen on the first floor of the Smart home. He quietly entered the house carrying a knife. He knew exactly where he was going. He climbed the stairs to the second floor, moving silently through the dark hallway. He opened the door to Elizabeth's bedroom. Mary Catherine was asleep in her bed. Elizabeth was asleep in hers. The room was quiet except for the gentle breathing of 2 sleeping girls. Mitchell approached Elizabeth's bed. He leaned over her. And then he did something that would haunt Mary Catherine for the rest of her life. He held a knife to Elizabeth's throat and whispered, "I have a knife at your neck. Don't make a sound. Get up and come with me." Elizabeth woke to the cold metal against her skin, to the terrifying whisper in the darkness. She was frozen with fear, disoriented, not fully understanding what was happening. Was this real? Was she dreaming? The man's grip tightened on her arm. "If you don't come with me, I'll kill you and your family," Mitchell whispered. In her bed a few feet away, Mary Catherine was awake. She'd heard something, sensed movement in the room. In the darkness, she could see a shadowy figure near Elizabeth's bed. She could hear whispered voices. Terror washed over her, but she remained absolutely still, pretending to be asleep, praying the intruder wouldn't notice her. Elizabeth, trembling, stood up from her bed. The man guided her toward the bedroom door, the knife always present, always threatening. She was wearing only her red pajamas and slippers. As they left the room, Elizabeth glanced back at her sister one last time. Their eyes met for just a moment. Then the intruder led Elizabeth out of the bedroom, down the hallway, down the stairs. Mary Catherine lay frozen in her bed, her heart pounding so loud she was sure it could be heard throughout the house. She listened as footsteps moved through the house below. She heard a door open, then silence. For what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Mary Catherine remained motionless, terrified that the man would come back. Finally, when she couldn't bear it any longer, she crept out of bed. She went to her parents' bedroom and gently shook her father awake. "Elizabeth is gone," Mary Catherine whispered, her voice shaking. "A man took her. He had a knife." Ed Smart sat up instantly, confused. "What? What are you talking about?" "A man came into our room," Mary Catherine said, starting to cry. "He took Elizabeth. He said he'd kill us if we made noise." Ed jumped out of bed, Lois right behind him. They rushed to the girls' bedroom. Elizabeth's bed was empty, the covers thrown back. They searched the house frantically, calling Elizabeth's name. They checked every room, every closet, the garage, the backyard. Elizabeth was gone. Ed picked up the phone and dialed 911. His voice was steady, but filled with controlled panic as he reported that his daughter had been taken from their home by an armed intruder. The call came in at approximately 4 a.m. on June 5, 2002. Within minutes, Salt Lake City police officers arrived at the Smart home. The house was sealed off as a crime scene. Detectives were called in. The FBI was notified, and the largest missing person search in Utah history began. But Elizabeth Smart was already miles away, being led up a steep mountain trail by a man she didn't remember meeting, heading toward a fate she couldn't imagine. As the sun rose over Salt Lake City on the morning of June 5, 2002, the Smart family's nightmare was just beginning. While police processed the crime scene and launched their search, Elizabeth Smart was being taken to a remote campsite in the mountains, overlooking the very city that would soon be desperately searching for her. Brian David Mitchell led Elizabeth up a steep trail behind her neighborhood. She was still in her red pajamas and slippers, stumbling over rocks and roots in the darkness. Every time she slowed down or hesitated, Mitchell would remind her of the knife, remind her of his threat to kill her family. Elizabeth was terrified, exhausted, and completely disoriented. After hiking for what felt like hours, they arrived at a crude campsite hidden in the dense forest. It consisted of little more than a tent and some supplies. Waiting there was Wanda Barzee, Mitchell's wife and accomplice. Elizabeth would later describe the overwhelming horror of that moment, realizing she'd been taken by not one person, but two, understanding that she was completely at their mercy in this isolated location where no one would hear her scream. What happened next was a nightmare that Elizabeth Smart would later have the courage to describe, though the details are difficult to hear. Mitchell performed what he called a marriage ceremony, reading from his twisted religious writings. He declared Elizabeth his wife, claiming that God had commanded him to take her. Then, despite Elizabeth's pleas and tears, despite her being just 14 years old, Mitchell assaulted her. Barzee stood guard outside the tent, complicit in the horror unfolding inside. This was only the first day. Elizabeth would endure 9 months of this captivity, 9 months of daily assaults, 9 months of psychological torture, 9 months of wondering if she would ever see her family again. Mitchell controlled Elizabeth through a combination of physical threats, psychological manipulation, and religious indoctrination. He forced her to wear robes and a veil that covered her face, claiming it was religious garb, but actually using it to disguise her identity. He gave her a new name, Esther, and forbade her from speaking her real name. He kept her tethered to him or Barzee with a cable, literally chaining her so she couldn't escape. But the chains weren't just physical. Mitchell was skilled at psychological manipulation. He told Elizabeth repeatedly that if she tried to escape, he would kill her family. He described in graphic detail how he would hurt her parents, her siblings. He made her believe that any attempt to run would result in the death of everyone she loved. For a 14-year-old girl who adored her family, this threat was devastatingly effective. Mitchell also used religious language and concepts to confuse and control Elizabeth. Coming from a deeply religious background herself, Elizabeth was vulnerable to his twisted theology. Mitchell claimed he was a prophet, that God had commanded this, that Elizabeth was fulfilling a divine purpose. It was spiritual abuse layered on top of physical and sexual abuse, creating a complex web of control. The first few weeks of captivity were spent primarily at the mountain campsite. Elizabeth was given minimal food and water. She was not allowed to bathe properly. She slept on the ground in the tent, often cold, always terrified. She could see the city lights of Salt Lake City spread out below. She was so close to home, yet completely trapped. During this time, the massive search for Elizabeth was underway in the city below. But no one thought to search the mountains directly behind the Smart neighborhood. The assumption was that an abductor would take a victim far away, not hide in plain sight just a few miles from the crime scene. As summer progressed, Mitchell began taking Elizabeth down into the city during the daytime. This might seem impossibly risky, but Mitchell had a strategy. He dressed Elizabeth in robes and a veil that completely obscured her face and hair. He positioned himself always between Elizabeth and other people. He held her arm tightly and kept that knife always present, always threatening. And he relied on people's reluctance to interfere in what appeared to be religious practice. They would walk through downtown Salt Lake City, panhandling for money. They attended outdoor concerts and public events. On several occasions, people came within feet of Elizabeth Smart, the girl whose face was on missing posters throughout the entire city, but no one recognized her. The disguise was effective, and the sheer audacity of taking her into public places actually worked in Mitchell's favor. No one expected a kidnapper to parade their victim through crowded areas. Elizabeth desperately wanted to call out, to reveal herself, to escape. But Mitchell's psychological control was firm. He walked slightly behind her, his hand always on her arm, the threat always implicit. He whispered reminders about what would happen to her family if she made a sound. And Elizabeth, traumatized and terrified, remained silent. There were heartbreaking near misses. On one occasion, they were stopped by police officers who were investigating reports of suspicious individuals in the area. The officers asked Mitchell who they were. Mitchell calmly explained they were religious missionaries. The officers looked at the veiled figure beside Mitchell, Elizabeth Smart, kidnapped girl, the subject of a massive manhunt. They asked if she was okay. Elizabeth, with Mitchell's hand gripping her arm, nodded silently. The officers let them go. Elizabeth would later describe the crushing despair of that moment. She'd been so close to rescue, but the fear of Mitchell carrying out his threats paralyzed her. She blamed herself for not speaking up, though she was a traumatized child under the control of an adult predator. The guilt would haunt her for years. As summer turned to fall, Mitchell decided the mountain campsite was becoming too risky with the approaching winter weather. He made a bizarre decision. They would travel to California. In September 2002, Mitchell, Barzee, and Elizabeth hitchhiked and used public transportation to travel from Salt Lake City to San Diego, California. This cross-state journey with a kidnapped child seems impossible, but it happened. Elizabeth was kept in her robes and veil. At bus stations and rest stops, she saw her own missing person posters on walls and bulletin boards. Her face stared back at her from photographs that seemed to be from a different lifetime. She was right there, and yet no one saw her. In San Diego, they lived on the streets for several months. They slept in parks and under bridges. They panhandled for money. Mitchell continued his pattern of daily assaults on Elizabeth. The abuse was relentless, and Elizabeth had no escape. She was hundreds of miles from home now, even further from any hope of rescue. But California proved difficult for Mitchell and Barzee. The weather was different. The police were more suspicious of transient groups, and they struggled to get enough money. By early 2003, Mitchell decided to return to Utah. In February, they made the long journey back to Salt Lake City. This decision would seal Mitchell's fate, though he didn't know it yet. Back in Utah, Mitchell resumed his pattern of taking Elizabeth into public places. They walked the streets of Salt Lake City. They went to the public library. They attended events at the Gateway Outdoor Shopping Center. And they were frequently seen by members of the public, though no one recognized Elizabeth beneath her disguise. But someone was paying attention, someone who would change everything. Back in June 2002, when Elizabeth had first been taken, her 9-year-old sister, Mary Catherine, had provided a description of the intruder to police. But she'd been terrified. It had been dark, and she'd only seen him briefly. She described him as a white man, but couldn't provide many details. The police sketch based on her description was generic and unhelpful. For months, Mary Catherine had been haunted by that night. The memory of the man in their bedroom played over and over in her mind. She desperately wanted to remember more, to help find her sister. Her parents never pressured her, but she put immense pressure on herself. Then, in October 2002, 4 months after Elizabeth's abduction, Mary Catherine had a breakthrough. One evening, while watching news coverage about her sister's case, something suddenly clicked in her memory. The voice of the intruder, she suddenly recognized it. She remembered where she'd heard that voice before. "It was Emmanuel," she told her parents. "The man who took Elizabeth was Emmanuel, the man who worked on our roof." This was the breakthrough the investigation needed. The Smarts immediately contacted police with this information. Emmanuel, whose real name was Brian David Mitchell, became the prime suspect. Police began searching for him. A sketch was drawn based on better descriptions from the Smarts and others who had encountered Mitchell. That sketch was distributed widely and shown repeatedly on local news. But Mitchell had vanished. Police searched known locations where he'd lived or camped. They investigated his former addresses, contacted his family members, alerted homeless shelters and social services. Mitchell seemed to have disappeared completely. No one knew that he was hiding in plain sight, walking the streets with his victim disguised beside him. Meanwhile, Elizabeth endured another winter. She'd been captive for 8 months now. She'd survived unimaginable trauma. She'd had her childhood stolen from her. But somehow, she held on to hope that someday, somehow, she would get home. That hope was about to be realized in the most unexpected way. On March 12, 2003, nearly 9 months after Elizabeth Smart was taken from her bedroom, an ordinary couple was driving through the suburb of Sandy, Utah, about 18 miles south of Salt Lake City. The couple, Anita and Rudy Daniels, were not thinking about missing children or manhunts. They were just running errands on a Wednesday afternoon. But as they drove past a shopping area near a Walmart, Anita noticed something unusual. 3 people were walking along the street, a bearded man in robes, a woman also in robes, and between them, a younger person completely covered in robes and a veil. Something about the group caught Anita's attention. "That's them," Anita said suddenly to her husband. "That's Emmanuel, and those people they've been looking for." Anita had seen the news reports about Brian Mitchell, also known as Emmanuel, who was wanted in connection with Elizabeth Smart's abduction. The sketch of Mitchell had been shown repeatedly on television, and the man walking down the street looked exactly like that sketch. But Rudy was skeptical. The chances of randomly spotting someone from a 9-month-old kidnapping case seemed impossibly low. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I'm sure," Anita insisted. "We need to call the police." Rudy called 911 and reported what they'd seen. The dispatcher took the information but seemed uncertain. They'd received countless false sightings of Mitchell over the past months. Still, officers were dispatched to investigate. The Daniels followed the group at a distance, keeping them in sight until police arrived. Within minutes, Sandy Police Department officers located the 3 individuals walking near the intersection of State Street and 8th Avenue. Officer Bill O'Neill and Officer Troy Rasmussen approached the group cautiously. The man matched the description of Brian David Mitchell. But was the veiled person with him really Elizabeth Smart? After 9 months, could she really be found just walking down a suburban street in the middle of the day? The officers identified themselves and asked the group to stop. Mitchell remained calm, claiming they were religious missionaries doing God's work. Barzee stood silently beside him. Between them, the figure in the veil kept her head down, face completely obscured. "We need to speak with everyone in your party," Officer O'Neill said firmly. "Can you please identify yourselves?" Mitchell provided his religious name and refused to give his real identity. Barzee did the same. The officers then turned to the veiled figure. "What's your name?" Officer O'Neill asked gently. There was silence. The veiled figure didn't respond. Mitchell spoke up, trying to answer for her, but O'Neill stopped him. "I need her to answer for herself," O'Neill said. "Ma'am, what is your name?" More silence. The tension was excruciating. The officers exchanged glances. This could be nothing, just suspicious individuals who had nothing to do with the Smart case. Or this could be the breakthrough everyone had been praying for. Officer Rasmussen tried a different approach. "Are you Elizabeth Smart?" he asked directly. The figure in the veil shifted slightly but said nothing. Mitchell interjected again, claiming this was his daughter, that they had a right to religious freedom, that the officers were harassing them. But the police weren't backing down. "Ma'am, I need you to answer," Officer O'Neill said, his voice kind but firm. "Are you Elizabeth Smart? You're not in trouble. We just need to know who you are." In that moment, Elizabeth Smart faced an impossible choice. For 9 months, she'd been controlled by fear that Mitchell would kill her family, that escaping would only make things worse. He'd trained her to be silent, to obey, to believe she had no way out. His psychological control was so complete that even with police officers right there, even with rescue literally standing in front of her, Elizabeth was terrified to speak. Mitchell's grip on her arm tightened. She could feel his warning without him saying a word. But something in the officer's voice, something in that moment, broke through the terror. "Yes," she said quietly. Her voice was barely audible, muffled by the veil. "What did you say?" Officer O'Neill asked gently. Elizabeth pulled down her veil slightly. Her face was visible for the first time in months to someone other than her captors. She was thin, pale, dirty, but she was alive. And in a voice that grew stronger with each word, she said, "I'm Elizabeth Smart." The officers later said that moment was one they would never forget. After 9 months of searching, after becoming a case that most people assumed would never be solved, Elizabeth Smart had been found alive. Officer O'Neill immediately radioed for backup and contacted detectives. Within minutes, the scene was swarming with police vehicles. Mitchell and Barzee were immediately separated from Elizabeth and placed under arrest. Elizabeth was gently guided to a police vehicle, away from the people who'd tormented her for 9 months. As officers spoke with her, confirming her identity and ensuring she was medically stable, Elizabeth asked one question over and over, "Is my family okay? Are they safe? Did he hurt them?" She'd lived for 9 months believing that any escape attempt would result in her family's death. Even now, rescued and safe, that fear dominated her thoughts. Officers assured her that her family was fine, that everyone was safe, that she was going home. The call came into the Smart household at approximately 3:30 p.m. on March 12, 2003. Ed Smart answered the phone and heard words he'd been desperately hoping to hear for 9 months. "Mr. Smart, we've found your daughter. Elizabeth is alive and safe." Ed dropped to his knees, overwhelmed. Lois heard him crying and rushed over, terrified something terrible had happened. When Ed told her Elizabeth had been found, they both collapsed in tears. Their other children came running, drawn by their parents' cries, and the family held each other and sobbed with relief and joy. Within the hour, Ed and Lois Smart were on their way to the police station where Elizabeth was being held. The reunion, captured partially on camera, was one of the most emotional moments in the history of American missing persons cases. Elizabeth ran to her parents and was enfolded in their arms. They held her and cried and told her over and over that she was safe, that they loved her, that she was home. Elizabeth's first words to her parents were apologies. "I'm sorry," she said through tears. "I'm so sorry I didn't get away. I tried to be brave, but I was so scared." The guilt she felt, though she had nothing to be guilty for, was heartbreaking. Her parents assured her that she had nothing to apologize for, that she'd survived, that she was incredibly brave, that all that mattered was that she was home now. They held her for a long time, this daughter they'd thought they might never see again, this child who'd been through unspeakable horror, but was somehow miraculously alive. That evening, the news that Elizabeth Smart had been found spread like wildfire. It was the lead story on every news outlet in America. The photographs and video footage of the Smart family's reunion brought tears to millions of viewers. After 9 months of darkness, after a case that had seemed hopeless, there was a happy ending. It was a miracle. The public reaction was overwhelming. Salt Lake City erupted in celebration. People who'd never met the Smarts cried tears of joy. The hundreds of volunteers who'd searched for Elizabeth felt vindicated in their efforts. The case had gripped the nation, and now the nation rejoiced. But for Elizabeth, the ordeal wasn't over. Physically, she would recover relatively quickly. Medically, she was found to be in surprisingly good health considering her months of captivity. But psychologically, the trauma ran deep. She'd been a 14-year-old girl when she was taken. She was 15 now, but the 9 months of captivity had aged her in ways that couldn't be measured in years. Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee were immediately charged with kidnapping and other crimes. As details of what Elizabeth had endured emerged, additional charges were added. The legal proceedings would take years to resolve, complicated by questions about Mitchell's mental competency and his bizarre religious delusions. Mitchell's defense attorneys argued that he was mentally ill and not competent to stand trial. Psychiatric evaluations were conducted. Mitchell's behavior in court was often bizarre. He would sing hymns loudly during proceedings, refusing to cooperate. But experts ultimately determined that while Mitchell had mental health issues, he understood the nature of his crimes and was competent to face trial. Wanda Barzee eventually accepted a plea deal. In 2009, she pleaded guilty to federal charges of kidnapping and unlawful transportation of a minor. She was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. She was released in 2018 after serving her sentence, though she remains under federal supervision for life. Mitchell went to trial in 2010, nearly 8 years after the kidnapping. Elizabeth, now 23 years old, had to testify about what she'd endured. In incredibly brave and detailed testimony, she described the 9 months of captivity, the daily assaults, the psychological manipulation, the terror she'd lived with constantly. It was difficult testimony to hear, but it was necessary. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. In May 2011, Brian David Mitchell was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. He will never be released. Justice was served, though no punishment could ever truly compensate for what he'd done. For Elizabeth Smart, life after captivity has been a journey of healing and purpose. She could have let the trauma destroy her. She could have retreated from public life, lived quietly, tried to forget. Instead, she chose a different path. In the months and years following her rescue, Elizabeth Smart faced challenges that most people cannot imagine. The 9 months of captivity had left deep psychological scars. She struggled with post-traumatic stress, with nightmares, with fear and anxiety. She'd missed months of school, months of normal teenage life. Her adolescence had been violently interrupted, and finding her way back to normalcy seemed impossible. But Elizabeth had something powerful on her side, the unwavering support of her family. Ed and Lois Smart made Elizabeth's recovery their top priority. They arranged for trauma therapy with specialists experienced in treating kidnapping victims. They protected her privacy fiercely, refusing media requests and shielding her from public scrutiny. They allowed her to heal at her own pace, without pressure or expectations. The Smart family also leaned heavily on their faith during this time. Their LDS community rallied around them, providing support and understanding. Church leaders offered counseling and spiritual guidance. For Elizabeth, who'd had religious language and concepts weaponized against her by Mitchell, reclaiming her faith was part of the healing process. She had to separate the twisted theology of her abuser from the genuine religious beliefs that had sustained her family. Slowly, gradually, Elizabeth began to reclaim her life. She returned to high school, though it meant facing the stares and whispers of classmates who knew her story. She reconnected with old friends and made new ones. She went to dances and football games. She tried to have normal teenage experiences, even though normal would always feel different now. One of the most significant steps in Elizabeth's recovery was finding her voice. Initially, she'd wanted privacy, wanted to hide from the world that had scrutinized her ordeal. But as she healed, she realized she had a story that could help others. She had survived something terrible, and that survival had meaning. In 2006, when Elizabeth was 18, she began speaking publicly about child safety and kidnapping prevention. Her first speeches were difficult. Talking about the trauma was painful, and facing audiences was terrifying. But she persevered because she believed her story could save lives. Elizabeth's message was powerful and specific. She talked about the warning signs that predators look for. She discussed how parents can teach their children to be safe without making them fearful. She emphasized that victims of abduction and assault should never blame themselves, that what happened to them was not their fault, no matter what they did or didn't do. Her advocacy work expanded over the years. She became a prominent voice in discussions about child protection laws. She worked with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. She lobbied for legislation to improve how law enforcement handles missing persons cases. She used her platform to advocate for other victims who didn't have her voice or resources. In 2009, Elizabeth graduated from high school. It was a major milestone, proof that she'd overcome the disruption Mitchell had caused in her education. She enrolled at Brigham Young University, where she studied music with a focus on harp performance, returning to the instrument she'd loved before her abduction. College gave Elizabeth a sense of normalcy. She was just another student, studying and socializing and figuring out her future. She served a Mormon mission in France from 2010 to 2011, an 18-month service commitment that allowed her to help others and continue her own healing. The mission experience was transformative. It gave her purpose beyond her trauma, an identity beyond kidnapping victim. In 2012, Elizabeth married Matthew Gilmore in a private ceremony in Hawaii. Matthew, who'd grown up in Scotland, was someone who loved Elizabeth for who she was, not despite her past or because of it. Their relationship was based on mutual respect, understanding, and genuine affection. For Elizabeth, finding love after everything she'd endured was a profound victory. Elizabeth and Matthew have since had 3 children together. Becoming a mother herself has brought both joy and challenges for Elizabeth. She's fiercely protective of her children, understandably anxious about their safety. But she's also determined to let them live full, free lives, not constrained by fear. Finding that balance has been part of her continued healing. Throughout her 20s and 30s, Elizabeth has become an increasingly prominent advocate and public figure. She's written 2 books about her experiences. My Story, published in 2013, detailed the kidnapping and its aftermath. Where There's Hope, published in 2018, focused on healing and moving forward after trauma. Both books became bestsellers and helped countless trauma survivors in their own recovery journeys. Elizabeth has also worked as a correspondent for ABC News, contributing to their coverage of missing persons cases and child safety issues. She's used her media platform to highlight other cases, to advocate for policy changes, and to educate the public about predatory behavior and protection strategies. One of Elizabeth's most important messages is about the treatment of sexual assault victims. She's been outspoken about victim blaming and the harmful ways society often responds to those who've been assaulted. She's advocated for better support systems, better legal protections, and better cultural understanding of trauma. Elizabeth has also been remarkably open about her own healing process, acknowledging that recovery isn't linear. She's spoken honestly about still having difficult days, about triggers that bring back memories, about the ongoing work of healing from trauma. This honesty has made her even more relatable and effective as an advocate. She doesn't pretend to have all the answers or to be completely healed. She's simply continuing to move forward. In interviews, Elizabeth often emphasizes that she refuses to let those 9 months define her entire life. Yes, the kidnapping happened. Yes, it was traumatic. But it was 9 months out of what she hopes will be many decades of life. She's determined to be known for what she's accomplished since then, not just for what happened to her. The transformation from victim to survivor to advocate to thriving adult has been extraordinary. Elizabeth Smart could have been destroyed by what happened to her. Instead, she's built a life of meaning, purpose, and joy. She's helped change laws that protect children. She's educated millions about child safety. She's given hope to countless trauma survivors who see in her story proof that healing is possible. Her family remains central to her life. Ed and Lois Smart are now grandparents, deeply involved with Elizabeth's children. Mary Catherine, the sister who witnessed the abduction, has also built a successful life. The bond between the sisters, forged in trauma but strengthened through healing, remains powerful. The Smart family as a whole has become advocates for missing children and child safety. They've used their experience to help other families going through similar ordeals. They've supported legislative efforts and worked with law enforcement to improve response protocols. They've turned their nightmare into a force for positive change. For Elizabeth personally, one of the most powerful aspects of her recovery has been reclaiming control over her own narrative. For years, her story was told by others, by the media, by investigators, by commentators and analysts. Now she tells her own story, in her own words, with her own emphasis. She decides what to share and what to keep private. That control is itself a form of healing. Elizabeth is now in her mid-30s. She's a wife, a mother, an author, an advocate, a survivor. She's living proof that even after the worst trauma, life can still be beautiful. That healing is possible. That victims can become victors. That hope is real. The case of Elizabeth Smart is remarkable not just because she survived, but because of what her survival has meant for countless others. Her case changed how law enforcement handles missing children cases. It transformed public understanding of kidnapping and trauma, and it provided a roadmap for healing that has helped thousands of survivors. One of the most significant impacts of Elizabeth's case was on Amber Alert protocols. While Amber Alerts existed before her kidnapping, her case highlighted weaknesses in the system. The fact that Elizabeth was hidden in plain sight for 9 months, walking through public areas while her face was on every missing poster, demonstrated that awareness alone wasn't enough. Law enforcement learned crucial lessons about searching in proximity to the crime scene. For months, investigators assumed Elizabeth had been taken far away from Salt Lake City. They didn't thoroughly search the mountain areas directly behind her neighborhood, which is where she was held for the first several months. This oversight led to changes in search protocols, ensuring that immediate surroundings are more thoroughly examined. The case also highlighted the importance of listening to child witnesses. Mary Catherine's initial description of the intruder wasn't detailed enough to identify Mitchell. But 4 months later, when she suddenly remembered recognizing his voice, that breakthrough led directly to identifying the suspect. Law enforcement now better understands that child witnesses may need time to process traumatic memories, and that follow-up interviews can yield critical information. Elizabeth's case demonstrated the power of media attention in missing persons cases. The relentless news coverage kept her face in the public consciousness for 9 months. It was that media saturation that ultimately led to her rescue. Anita Daniels recognized Mitchell because she'd seen his sketch repeatedly on television. While media attention can sometimes complicate investigations, in Elizabeth's case, it was essential. The case also exposed uncomfortable truths about how people respond to others in distress. Elizabeth walked through downtown Salt Lake City countless times. She was stopped by police officers. She encountered hundreds of people. No one intervened. The robes and veil she wore created a religious context that made people hesitant to question or interfere. We've learned that religious or cultural garb can be weaponized by abductors to hide victims in plain sight. This has led to better training for law enforcement and the public about indicators of trafficking and coercion. Officers are now trained to look for signs of control, the person who won't speak for themselves, who seems afraid, who's always accompanied by someone who answers for them. These red flags should prompt further investigation, regardless of claimed religious or cultural practices. Elizabeth's advocacy work has particularly focused on changing how society responds to sexual assault victims. She's spoken powerfully about the harmful concept of damaged goods, the idea that assault ruins a person permanently. This damaging belief, often inadvertently reinforced by well-meaning people, can prevent survivors from healing and moving forward. In one famous speech, Elizabeth compared this concept to a chewed piece of gum or a crushed flower, metaphors sometimes used in abstinence education to describe people who've had sexual experiences. She explained how harmful these metaphors were to her recovery making her feel worthless and irreparably damaged. Her advocacy has helped change how educators and community leaders discuss these topics, emphasizing that a person's worth is never diminished by assault. Elizabeth has also been vocal about the importance of believing victims. Too often, assault survivors face skepticism and victim blaming. Elizabeth experienced this herself. After her rescue, there were people who questioned why she hadn't escaped sooner, why she'd walked through public places without calling out for help, why she seemed to comply with her captors. These questions reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of trauma and control. Through her advocacy, Elizabeth has helped educate the public about trauma bonding, learned helplessness, and the psychological tactics used by abusers to control their victims. She's explained that asking, "Why didn't you just leave?" isn't helpful. It blames the victim for the abuser's actions and ignores the complex psychological dynamics of captivity. The legal proceedings against Mitchell and Barzee also set important precedents. Mitchell's case involved lengthy battles over competency to stand trial. His attorneys argued that his mental illness made him incompetent, but prosecutors successfully argued that mental illness doesn't automatically equal incompetency. The case helped clarify legal standards for competency evaluations in cases involving defendants with severe mental health issues. For the missing persons community, Elizabeth's case provides both hope and caution. It's hope because it proves that even after months or years, missing children can be recovered alive. It's caution because it demonstrates how easy it is to hide someone in plain sight, how victims can be right in front of us without being recognized. Organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children have used Elizabeth's case extensively in their training programs. They teach parents, educators, and law enforcement about predator behavior, grooming tactics, and protection strategies. Elizabeth herself has been directly involved in these educational efforts, lending her voice and story to help protect other children. The psychological research community has also studied Elizabeth's case extensively. Her recovery trajectory has provided valuable insights into trauma resilience. Researchers have examined what factors contributed to her ability to heal and thrive after captivity: her strong family support, her pre-existing religious faith, her sense of purpose and advocacy, her access to quality mental health care, and her own internal resilience. This research has helped inform treatment approaches for other trauma survivors. While every person's healing journey is unique, Elizabeth's experience has contributed to our understanding of what helps people recover from severe trauma. Perhaps most importantly, Elizabeth Smart's story has given hope to countless survivors of kidnapping, trafficking, and sexual assault. When people see that someone who went through such horror can heal, can build a happy life, can find love and meaning and joy, it provides a powerful counter-narrative to the idea that trauma permanently breaks people. Elizabeth receives letters and messages from survivors around the world who tell her that her story gave them hope during their darkest moments. Some are children who were abducted and escaped. Some are adults who survived childhood abuse. Some are trafficking victims who managed to get free. They all found in Elizabeth's story proof that survival is possible, that healing is real, that life can still be beautiful on the other side of trauma. The case has also had unexpected impacts on policy and legislation. Several states have passed laws named after Elizabeth Smart or inspired by her case. These laws have strengthened penalties for child kidnapping, improved Amber Alert systems, enhanced protection for trafficking victims, and increased funding for trauma treatment. On a more personal level, Elizabeth's story has changed countless individual families. Parents who heard about her case became more vigilant about their children's safety. They installed better locks, taught their kids about stranger danger, and paid more attention to who had access to their homes. Some of these precautions have undoubtedly prevented other tragedies. For Elizabeth herself, the legacy she's building extends far beyond her 9 months of captivity. She's using her platform to address issues like human trafficking, online safety for children, support for sexual assault survivors, and mental health advocacy. She's appeared before Congress to testify about child protection legislation. She's worked internationally on human rights issues. In interviews today, Elizabeth often emphasizes that she doesn't want to be defined by those 9 months. She wants to be known for the decades of advocacy work, for the families she's helped, for the changes she's made to law and policy, for the hope she's provided to survivors. The kidnapping was something that happened to her, but it's not who she is. That distinction between what happened to you and who you are is perhaps the most powerful lesson from Elizabeth Smart's story. Trauma is real, and its effects are lasting, but it doesn't have to be the defining feature of a person's life. Healing is possible, growth is possible, joy is possible. The story of Elizabeth Smart is one of the most extraordinary cases in American history, not just because of the horror of what she endured, but because of the miracle of her survival and the power of her recovery. It's a story that reminds us of both the worst and best of humanity. Brian David Mitchell represents the worst, a predator who used religious language to justify unspeakable acts, who stole a child's innocence and 9 months of her life. But Elizabeth herself represents the best: resilience, courage, the refusal to be defined by trauma, the determination to turn suffering into purpose. For Ed and Lois Smart and their family, those 9 months were a nightmare that no parent should ever endure. But their unwavering love and support for Elizabeth demonstrated the healing power of family. They never gave up hope. They never stopped searching. And when Elizabeth came home, they focused on her recovery rather than on revenge. For Mary Catherine, the 9-year-old sister who witnessed the kidnapping and later provided the crucial information that identified the kidnapper, the experience shaped her life profoundly. But like Elizabeth, she's built a life beyond that trauma. For the community of Salt Lake City and the nation that followed Elizabeth's case, it was a journey through darkness that ended in light. The collective joy at her rescue was a reminder that hope matters, that communities can come together in crisis, that miracles do happen. Today, more than 20 years after that June night, when she was taken from her bedroom, Elizabeth Smart is thriving. She's a wife, a mother, an accomplished advocate, and a beacon of hope for trauma survivors worldwide. She's proof that the human spirit can endure and overcome even the worst circumstances. If you or someone you know is dealing with the aftermath of trafficking, kidnapping, or assault, please reach out for help. Organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, RAIN, and local crisis centers provide support and resources. Elizabeth's story proves that healing is possible and that you're not alone. Thank you for watching this incredibly difficult but ultimately hopeful story. Please leave a comment with your thoughts and subscribe to Seek Stories for more true crime cases with extraordinary outcomes. Remember Elizabeth Smart's message: you are not defined by what happened to you. You are defined by how you choose to move forward.